Okay, so welcome everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. My name is William Rex, and I work for the International Water Management Institute, or IMI. I'll be your host for this webinar. Let me just start with a couple of items of housekeeping. Firstly, our apologies for the fact that we didn't manage to get our interpretation arrangements for this session to work, so we'll be operating only in English. Second, this is a big topic. We've only got an hour, so we're going to be moving fairly quickly. Third, please add questions and suggestions to the chat in the Pathable system, and we'll do our best to address them as we progress and at the end. This session has been jointly organized by the Global Water Partnership, IUCN, IMI, and the World Bank. You could think of us as a coalition of the willing. We've come together because we share a common concern about water storage. So let me say up front, while we're talking about water storage, we're talking about all forms of terrestrial water storage. Natural and built, surface and subsurface, big and small. So when we use the word storage, please don't think that it's code for dams or managed aquifer recharge or any other specific storage technology. The whole point is to start thinking about storage in an integrated way. The second introductory disclaimer we need to make is that we don't believe that all the world's water problems are going to be solved by storage. There's a much broader storage agenda that still needs to be addressed. Storage, for example, is not a substitute for demand management, efficiency or productivity measures, better water allocation, etc., etc. Having made these disclaimers, let me start by summarizing everything we want to say today in 3 simple points. First, water storage is a vital issue for the world today. It lies at the heart of both the climate and sustainable development agendas, and we believe it's growing in importance. Second, our current approaches to water storage are not good enough. They're not storing enough water. They can be slow and expensive, and sometimes even destructive or counterproductive. Third, we believe we can do better. It's a complex and long-term challenge, and it starts very simply by thinking differently about storage. So that's the point of today's webinar. It's to start thinking differently about storage. This webinar builds on a joint GWP-IMI perspectives paper that was launched earlier this year, as well as ongoing analytic work by the World Bank. There are links to the perspectives paper in the files section of your screen, as well as to the video of the launch event earlier this year. And Eileen will speak about the World Bank's paper later in this session. So today's session, as you can see from this outline, is in 5 parts. First, I'm going to briefly talk about why storage and why now. Then we'll move on to Rachel, who's going to summarize the storage challenge today through some basic data that we've been able to pull together. The third is Winston's going to address the question of what an integrated storage agenda looks like. Fourth, Eileen and Kimberly are going to talk about some of the lessons to date. And fifth, we're going to conclude through James on some of the questions in the chat, provide some reflections on the road ahead. So why storage and why now? In a nutshell, freshwater storage provides the world with 3 vital services. The first one is increasing water availability. And of course, it does this by changing the distribution of water across time. The second key service is to reduce the impact of floods. And the third is to regulate water levels or other characteristics which provide a variety of other services such as energy generation, transportation, leisure activities, etc. Now, each of these services obviously provides very direct benefits, but they also provide indirect benefits by bringing increasing certainty in the world as we know it today. So not only does it help a particular, for example, business benefit from water now, but it also gives them the confidence to invest in the future, thereby having a variety of knock-on effects on jobs and livelihoods and so forth. So if that's why we're most interested in storage, why now? And of course, as all of you no doubt are seeing constantly as well, you can barely open a newspaper or a web page without seeing some manifestation of water challenges or water crises across the world, whether these be about the latest thinking on or the latest evidence on climate through the IPCC report, or floods in Europe, or what's going on in the Colorado River in the US. These kind of issues are everywhere. We're all talking about them. And it's our belief that storage in its various manifestations is one of the common issues that lies at the heart of many of these challenges. Why now particularly? Well, again, there are three broad trends that we as a water community are constantly talking about. Growing demand, brought about by both population and economic growth, increasing climate variability, and accelerating environmental degradation. And those all come together to create, if you like, a perfect storm of bad news for water storage, because they're simultaneously reducing the amount of water that can be stored, but also increasing the need for it. And as this sort of stylized diagram on the right shows, we have a variety of needs, both at present and in the future, that come from different sectors of the economy or people or the environment. And then we also have a variety of storage solutions, be they nature-based or built or some combination of the two. And the challenge as we see it is that the gap between what we have or what we need and what we have is growing and will continue to grow into the future. So that, in a nutshell, is the challenge that we see before us when we're talking about an integrated storage agenda. And now I'm going to turn over to Rachel to take us a little more into the details of that story. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Thank you. So one of our first findings on water storage was how incomplete the data is, particularly when trying to build a global picture. It's obviously difficult to directly measure how much water is in underground or in other forms of natural storage, but even global databases on large dams are incomplete. For example, some dams are not included, or others are included, but we don't know how much water is stored or the geolocation of it. Nevertheless, based on the belief that some data is better than none, we're going to share a few snapshots based on the best estimates we pulled together. This data is largely based on the best previously published estimates, which was pulled together by Matthew McCartney, which a publication will be following soon from Emmy. Next slide. Oh, thank you. There are two key points to gather from this slide. The first is about the forms of terrestrial or land-based freshwater storage, and the second about their relative volumes. There are broadly 8 forms of terrestrial freshwater storage across the world, as illustrated in this figure. As you can see from the percentages, groundwater makes up a vast percentage of that. However, groundwater is not evenly distributed, nor is it all available for abstraction. Some groundwater is physically inaccessible due to its location or economically unavailable due to the cost required to extract it. Mountain glaciers and lakes make up the next largest portions of our terrestrial water storage. Interestingly, though, built storage, and in this case, small and large dam reservoirs, makes up an extremely small portion of our terrestrial water storage, about 0.1%. This point that all built storage that humankind has developed over centuries makes up 1/10 of 1% of total storage points to the key issues we need to address. The critical issue with storage is not the quantity of water stored, but the services or benefits that it provides. Groundwater that can't be accessed yet doesn't yet provide a service, but most built storage that was built was presumably built with the developers thinking it would provide a service. This service framing and what it means for the complementary nature of natural and built storage is one of the key issues we need to collectively explore. Next slide, please. The amount of freshwater storage is changing over time. While built storage and paddy fields have increased by over 7,000 billion cubic meters since 1970, our natural storage has decreased by over 26,000 billion cubic meters. And this is likely due to a combination of climate change, as is the case for glaciers, overuse, as is the case for groundwater, and environmental degradation, as is the case for wetlands. While the increase in dam storage might seem like an optimistic trend to some, it's important to keep a few things in mind. First, most of this storage was added in the first half of the 50-year global dam building boom. Second, many of these dams have declining storage due to rising sedimentation. And third, as we'll discuss in the rest of the session, we can't look at individual storage types in isolation. We must look at natural and built storage together. In summary, while the global population has roughly doubled since 1970, and the climate has become increasingly more variable, the world has seen a net storage loss of 19,000 billion cubic meters. Next slide, please. With this slide, we're turning our attention to the huge variation in storage both across and within countries. The amount of storage needed by countries depends on many factors. Here we present some of the key drivers of storage needs highlighted in green. Every country varies significantly on how much storage they need and use, as every country has different demands and aspirations. The water intensity of economies varies hugely across the world. The size of a country's agricultural sector or its water-intensive industries greatly impact how much water the country requires and uses. Not only do countries have varying water demands, but they also vary in the precipitation they receive. Inter and intra-annual variability is not uniform across countries or even within a country. Some countries have reliable precipitation throughout the year, while others do not. And this variability is only anticipated to worsen with climate change, thus emphasizing the need for reliable storage. Next, natural terrestrial water storage distribution is not even across countries. For example, some have significant storage in glaciers, while others have huge groundwater resources. And due to these uneven distributions in natural storage and climate variability, some countries rely heavily on built storage. Built storage per capita ranges dramatically across countries, from none to thousands of cubic meters per capita. However, with aging infrastructure and increasing sedimentation, the maintenance and upkeep of these structures is vital to maintain their full usage. Finally, different regions of the world experience vastly different hydrological events. Some are extremely vulnerable to droughts, others to floods. While these events undoubtedly present physical vulnerabilities to communities, the economic vulnerability to floods and droughts is also important to consider. The more valuable the social, environmental, or economic assets under threat are, the more important protecting them is to that society. Storage per capita benchmarks aside, a country's flood or drought risk plays a key role in determining its storage needs. Thank you, and with that, I'll turn it over to Winston Yu.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Next slide. Rachel just gave an excellent overview of the global picture, while William presented the motivation why this is critical. To make these ideas practical for actual governments and communities, I think we need to move from the pictures you saw to actually quantifying some of these storage gap concepts at the country level, the basin level, and even at the community level. And I think as many of us started this journey with this work, we were surprised to see, just how little information is out there. Thus, demonstrating that there's definitely a space for new analytics, and as Rachel also pointed out, additional data. And just to give some quick examples, as Rachel mentioned, there are lots of global data sets on large dams. Some of it is more complete than others. Getting a good understanding today of how much built storage, and certainly in countries I've worked, I always find it kind of surprising that we have a good understanding of the big stuff, but all the smaller structures that are out there may not be well cataloged or inventoried. Same on the natural side. We may have a good sense of, where are the big lakes and big wetlands, but smaller things may go unseen. And then to compound this question of how much existing storage is there, to project that into the future, as Rachel had pointed out, in terms of sedimentation and changes on the natural side, very challenging. And so, even with this first bullet, you can see that there's a lot to do just to understand how much storage does a specific country, a specific basin, or even a community have, and how much will exist into the future. Certainly, many of you probably saw the recent IPCC reports and the challenges there, and how much future variability and uncertainty we will face for countries and for basins. Getting a good handle on these risks will be quite critical to identifying how much future storage is needed. And then even beyond that, even if we can, let's say, with some reasonable level of accuracy, predict extreme events, understanding community vulnerabilities and country vulnerabilities to those extreme events is another analytical exercise. On top of, for all of us who work on water resource management, making sort of your basic projections of future demands for the various services that storage can help provide and provide more reliably, from water supply, sanitation, to the environment, water quality, transport, so forth and so forth. We, I think, all have lived the challenges with that. And then lastly, and I'll come back to this in a moment, since a big part of the message here is about integration and looking at a wider set of storage options, understanding the landscape hydrological processes is a field of study in itself. And in some cases, we don't fully understand our surface groundwater interactions, or the relationship between the landscape and wetlands, or how human changes to the landscape can affect hydrology. And so these are also data gaps and information gaps in thinking about how we use storage better. Next slide. And so if we think about the landscape where we live, if we take a government perspective, or a river basin perspective, or a community perspective, in this landscape, as was mentioned earlier, we have built elements and we have natural elements. And the real challenge here, and I think the call that we're putting out there, is to think a bit more about how we operationalize these different elements and integrate them. Okay, we have a lot of different storage that is there. And we need to think of it as a larger system that is providing a whole suite of services to these different stakeholders, rather than, sort of a collection of individual facilities. So this dam, that wetland, this groundwater aquifer, but rather what we need is to think about it much more holistically. And the reason to think about this as a system, and as a system that is providing a range of services, is that if we can think about this in this way, we can then look at these different elements and the different attributes that they can provide. So things as basic as the size of the storage, to how adaptable is this particular element, how controllable, how reliable, vulnerable, sustainable, and so forth. And with a better understanding of these individual criteria for these different storage types, we can then think about how we package this together to, again, provide maximally the services that communities and governments want. Now, the one key challenge, as I mentioned earlier, is understanding the interactions between the built and natural world. Certainly, we all recognize that there are codependencies, and the relationship works both ways. The built world affects the natural world affects the built world. One key here is to see if there are also co-benefits. And so, you'll see in the literature, a lot of people are talking about nature-based approaches and the potential to also be reducing greenhouse gas emissions as one of several benefits. Okay, next slide. So just to wrap up, I'd be remiss if I didn't say something about governance, especially in the context of integration, We use the word integration quite a bit, but here, as William mentioned in his opening remarks, storage is indeed one instrument of many that the water resource planner has in her toolbox. But what we're proposing here, this idea of expanding our concept of what storage is, potentially also means we're bringing in a wider set of stakeholders and shareholders to include in this planning process. And like with all things about integration, this may make things more complicated and at the same time more inclusive, and potentially what we hope is more equitable. And so by thinking about this broader approach to storage, we're hoping that this will push further the space to create a shared understanding of the role of storage in our environments and ultimately what is needed. So with that, thank you, and over to Eileen and colleagues at the bank.
Thanks, Winston, and everyone else for queuing this up so well. So Kimberly and I are going to talk a little bit about lessons to date and the question of how. Winston was highlighting that if we're taking this new integrated approach, this new systems approach to storage, it really forces us to turn some of our original thinking on our head, or at least to expand it, to include more stakeholders, but also to look at how storage, the different forms of storage and different forms of water resources management interact with each other. So next slide, please. So we at the World Bank have been setting out, along with some of our partners, to look at the question of how do we do this in a real sense in the real world. And we're undertaking a global study, trying to set out a conceptual framework for integrated development and management of storage solutions, as well as case studies looking at this, building on the recent work, the paper of EME and GWP that William and others have outlined today. And in doing so, we took a survey of the biggest challenges that we see our clients facing with regard to integrated storage management. What types of questions are they actually looking at on the ground to be able to approach storage in an integrated fashion? It's one thing to sort of talk about in our hallowed halls, when we're sitting back in our offices, what it would look like to do this, but it's another thing to actually put it into practice on the ground. So next slide, please. So I wanted to share some of these questions with you today, not because we're going to be able to cover all of these in any detail in the study, but as William was saying, we're sort of looking to build a coalition of the willing. If we're really going to be pushing forward this new integrated approach to storage, it's going to take a lot of work on everyone's behalf. Whether you're an academic, a student, a practitioner, a think tank, or a government. And so I wanted to sort of outline these so that people are aware of the challenges that are being faced. And if we have students or academics out there that are looking for new topics to take on, please join us in this effort. We need all the help we can get in taking this forward. So systems, questions like how do we engage in systems planning, integrated green and gray at a system scale, and more holistic planning, recognizing that a lot of client governments start with master plans, single sector master plans, or engineering focused plans. How do we take a step back and integrate these from a systems perspective? How do we begin to determine operating rules for multi-purpose and multi-stakeholder benefits, getting these stakeholders around the table in a way that Winston was already talking about with vested interests on the ground. I don't want to go through all of these in great detail because Kimberly has some examples, a case study that we want to share with you, but we've outlined some of these with regard to agriculture, with regard to watershed management. Next slide, please. Looking at energy issues, urban issues, how do you manage a day zero situation? We see many clients in major cities approaching day zero situations, but we also recognize that day zero situations are in some ways a luxury. Many countries haven't reached the point yet where they have multi weeks of water storage upstream of cities that they are managing in a practical manner. So looking at case studies around these as well. So next slide. So we put out a call for examples, a call for case studies around these major challenges that we faced. And we are going to be writing some of them up in the study that will be coming out later this year. But a major thanks, I see some of our partners are on the call who have been involved in this process. So thank you very much for the cases you brought to us today. I'm going to hand over to Kimberly Lyon, who's a water resources management specialist at the World Bank, who's going to take us through one case study that we think highlights a lot of the elements we're looking at in this integrated storage approach, from looking at basin to city level, looking at integrating green and gray with multi-sectoral stakeholders. So Kim, over to you.
Thank you, Eileen. Thanks, William. So, as Eileen mentioned with the survey, several examples have started to come in response to the survey, and they all employ integrated approaches to storage to varying degrees. But for today, we're going to look at Bintuk as an interesting urban example, which brings together many of the elements that we have been talking about so far. So for context, Namibia is a very arid country. It's the most arid in sub-Saharan Africa. All the rivers that are wholly within the country are ephemeral rivers, and the only rivers that run all year round are those that it shares with its neighbors, mostly to the north and to the south. And in an average year, so the capital city of Windhoek, which rests in the middle of this map, really, in the central area of Namibia, of Windhoek, it's the economic and industrial heart of the country. It's a growing city with growing water demands, but it's very water scarce and has a history of severe droughts. And in an average year, the city only receives about 360 millimeters per year. And you can see that there are some months in the year where it receives virtually no rainfall at all. So this leaves very little for recharge to the natural systems, both the surface and the groundwater systems. Next slide, please. And I should mention that, the vast majority of the rainfall, 83% of it is lost to evaporation. So as you can see, drought resilience, it has been a significant focus for the city. And over the decades, the city has evolved a multi-pronged solution to these vulnerabilities. They have an interconnected storage system, which enables them to conjunctively manage their surface and groundwater resources together. They have invested in increasing water storage as security against drought. And this has included the use of managed aquifer recharge. They have a water demand management plan and a drought response plan that has helped them to be more strategic in their use of storage. And they have invested in unconventional water sources, such as wastewater reclamation. In fact, Windhoek is the first city in the world to do direct potable reuse and has been doing so for over 30 years. So that's one of the first lessons, really, that building resilience with storage for many places isn't a single technology solution. It's a sort of all of the above approach that is needed. Next slide, please. So in Bintuk, the various reservoirs are connected by canals so that the water can be transferred from reservoir to reservoir. This gives them some flexibility to manage their surface water. And some of this water is banked underground. And this water that is banked is, as I said, comes from the reservoirs, but it's also commingled with the city's water that comes from the water reclamation plant. And this combination of demand and supply side measures, as was mentioned previously, they have the demand management plan, they have a whole drought response plan, looking at unconventional water sources. All of this together has led Bintuk to significantly improve its system reliability during drought. So as William mentioned up front, we can't really look at storage in isolation. And we need to consider it in the context of other demand and supply side interventions. Next slide, please. As to the question of why the city would want to move water between its surface reservoirs, well, this has a lot to do with reducing evaporation. So in Namibia, the dams can lose anywhere between 20 and 85% of their water to evaporation in a single season. And so by moving water from reservoirs that have a flatter bathymetric profile to those that have more of a V-shaped profile, they can reduce the surface area and therefore reduce evaporative losses. It's really one of the only examples where I have seen that this has been practiced. And so this is when we talk about what are the operating rules that need to be put in place to manage an integrated system. This is one example where this has been innovated upon. Next slide, please. So evaporation, which is public enemy number one, also makes storing water underground an attractive and more drought resilient solution compared to keeping all of the water stored in the surface reservoirs. And through the managed aquifer recharge scheme for the city, the Bintuk system, the city can bank water when there's a surplus and then draw on it when there is a drought. To be able to safeguard the quality of the water that is injected into the aquifer, because it's a direct injection system, the Bintuk system has a central polishing plant. And remember, this water that's being injected underground comes from reservoirs as well as from the wastewater reclamation plant. So for Bintuk, investing in MAR turned out also to be cheaper than some of the other alternatives to improve their resilience to drought. They had looked at desal. They had also looked at doing an interbasin transfer from one of the perennial rivers up north. So the MAR system came out to be more cost effective than some of the other options. And their ultimate aim for this system, which is being implemented in stages, is for the aquifer to be able to supply up to 80% of Bintuk's full demand, of Bintuk's demand when it's full. Next slide, please. So the MAR scheme was conceptualized during the 1996 water crisis. And as I said, it's being implemented in phases, but this has been accelerated or was accelerated during the drought of 2015. They had a very severe drought in the region from 2015 to 2017. And so here that adage applies, never waste a good crisis. And we can't underestimate how much a good crisis can help to line up the incentives to get difficult things done, because not everybody was on board with this plan in the beginning. Now implementing the scheme took a considerable amount of planning, as you can imagine. Importantly, they needed to agree on a solution for ensuring good water quality that was injected. So this included putting together that central polishing plant, the water is treated that comes from the reservoirs, and they also implemented some urban planning measures to protect the source. So if you look at the map, these colored boxes are the different parts of the Bintuk aquifer. And you can see that they are south of the built-up area, and so they're south of the city. And you can't really see on the map, but in the north of the city is where all of the industrial zones have been located. So deliberately located away from the aquifer in order to protect the source. So the MAR scheme is also a partnership. And as I said, it took the crisis to get everybody on board. It was spearheaded by the city of Bintuk with support from NamWater, which is the national bulk water supplier, and eventually backed by the central government through the Ministry of Agriculture, Water and Forestry. Next slide, please. And this partnership continues into operation. There's an institutional agreement between the city of Bintuk, which serves as the scheme operator, and then NamWater is the bulk water supplier. And this whole integrated system also involves the private sector through an operation and maintenance agreement for the wastewater reclamation plant. Winkhawk is the operator for that, and that's a consortium of private actors. So, and all of this, is underpinned by a long-term planning process. At a national level, there's the IWRM plan for Namibia, launched in 2010. The city of Bintuk has also had its integrated business plan, and now it has a strategic transformation plan for everybody to sort of line up to put all of the pieces together to form this sophisticated system, which involves the public and private sector across multiple levels to be able to conjunctively manage the water that is stored both above and below ground. And it's also an interesting example because it includes built infrastructure working together with natural systems, and it's an approach that utilizes supply and demand side measures. So it's a really kind of holistic approach, not without its hiccups in implementation, but there's a lot more that can be told about this water management story in Bintuk, but hopefully this has been able to give a sense of how they have used an integrated approach to storage to be able to reduce their vulnerability to drought, and employing all of these different approaches into a fairly integrated system, which has yielded good results for them so far. And now over to James.
Great, thank you very much, Kimberly. What an excellent but also challenging range of presentations, giving us a new way of thinking about storage, but also raising lots of questions, as we can see on the chat. So let's just go into some of those questions. I think first, actually, to you, Winston, some of the things that you raised in your presentation, also Rachel did as well, about the actual storage gap. But to actually understand the storage gap and to know how to fill it, so to speak, there is obviously a data gap. And you talked about new analytics and new data needed. And I wonder if you can maybe explain to us a little bit more about what type of mechanisms there are to fill that data gap. What's the sort of new innovations? How can we really collect that type of information?
Okay, James. Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And it's not so easy to answer, but let me say, working with country clients and governments, there's always a request for investments for hard infrastructure, right? And I think often what gets missed is the data infrastructure and the interest in trying to build that knowledge base. I think many have heard the commonly said phrase, we can't manage what we can't measure. It's the same with storage. I can't tell you the number of countries where we might be providing financing to build infrastructure, but the interest in, let's say, building an inventory of not only the existing assets, but as I mentioned earlier, smaller assets. It's sometimes a hard sell because countries, if they're borrowing funds, they have to make very tough choices about how those funds are used. So I do think there is a quite a bit that needs to be done to make the case for data infrastructure and
20 minutes?
Case for investing in data infrastructure. Similarly, on the natural side of things, there was a question in the chat about glaciers. This is a huge area of study, and to date, if a lot of the scholarship is using great remote sensing techniques, and that's wonderful, and that's helping a lot. But as a country government, you need stations. You need to put in snowpack monitoring fields. There's so much that needs to be done in terms of just being able to understand your natural environment to get to this basic question about how much existing storage, right? And that's just one piece of the bigger data issue. And I could go on and on about all the kinds of data that are needed, but the point I want to make is that we have a lot to do, I think, to convince clients and communities, river basin authorities, on the need to invest in that monitoring and data infrastructure. Over. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Winston. Okay, so that leads very well into a question posted in the chat from Wesley Pereira. He's asking about reservoir planning and based on the fact that obviously infrastructure is planned based on historical records. They're not going to work very well going forward with climate change, and the whole sort of environment that we're working with here is changing. William, I wonder if you have any sort of reflections on that, about how to deal with that disruptive space that we're operating in right now to try and figure out how we fill that storage gap.
Yeah, and maybe just to start by building on something that Winston said, which is that I think I'm also often struck by different types of data that are needed at different stages in thinking. And I think one of the things that our work is pointing to is the need for more what you could consider to be very upstream broad data. Because if we're thinking about systems and the way they're managed, and we're thinking about integrated storage, so numerous different types of storage and how they fit together, we need to be thinking about what is quite broad and high level data, as well as the very specific data that would be needed to, let's say, develop and operate a piece of large infrastructure. And I think that broad and high level type data is in the world today probably more often going to come from remote sensing type instruments than on the ground instruments. And that's where I hope to see, I think, a lot of innovation in the future. And again, that's not data that's going to help us develop a very specific piece of infrastructure. It's not detailed enough, it's not accurate enough usually, but it is data that might help policymakers think differently about the challenge, which is of course the starting point. Because then as we get into the type of challenge that Wesley was talking about of, okay, so we have some pre-existing infrastructure, some dams, and they're starting to behave differently as the hydrology changes, as the climate changes, and potentially as user expectations change. I mean, there's obviously a contractual and legal, et cetera, side of that that's very hard to address in the abstract. But I think as it relates to our model, I think part of the challenge would be, I mean, firstly, yes, absolutely. In many places, historical data is going to be decreasingly useful as a way of planning for the future. But I think that one of our key points would be that resilience, we need to be increasingly thinking about resilience being found in the system, not in the facility. Okay? So as we think, for example, about the performance of a particular dam, we need to be thinking increasingly about the performance of that dam within its broader watershed, with the flows between soil moisture, forests, wetlands, and the dam itself. And that has obviously the very old story, the practical side of reducing sedimentation, et cetera. But it also has the more hydrological balance question of how do we manage water more at the system scale so that when we want to turn it into hard flows from a dam, we're relying on the system, not simply on that one piece of infrastructure. And you know, I think that also relates to some of the questions that have come up around, for example, do we include soil moisture? Do we include this and that? And I think the answer there is yes, they all need to be included, but they may all be providing different services. And that's part of the challenge from our perspective, is how do we start to aggregate up both the picture of the different facilities into a system scale for the sake of resilience, planning, repurposing, et cetera. But how do we also unpack that range of services? So soil moisture, for example, provides a robust and reliable service for rain-fed agriculture. It doesn't really for bulk water supply for an urban center. And so again, taking this up to the system scale and working out how do we manage it collectively, I think is the way that we need to go. And obviously easier said than done, but we need to start somewhere. Thanks, James.
Great, thanks, William. So you mentioned something that leads very, very nicely into the discussion around the Windhoek example from Kimberly, and it also builds on quite a lot of comments in the chat, and that is that we're looking at resilience in the system, not in the facility. Now, based on your presentation, Kimberly, it seems like it was the crisis in 2016, and also a point raised by Eileen about countries really facing these sort of day zero situations. So if that crisis sparked this reflection on storage and all of these technical options were looked at, but actually in the end, if I'm not mistaken, Kimberly, they went for homegrown options. They looked at managed aquifer recharge, they looked at reservoir profiles, and they looked at more simple, possibly more sustainable, perhaps a little bit more complicated from a coordination perspective, but ultimately local solutions. Would that be right? And at the same time, was this also more cost effective?
Yes, that's right. As I said, they had considered doing an interbasin transfer that wouldn't have been. It might have been more technically simple, but it would have been institutionally more complex. It's a transboundary river basin. I think they looked at all of their options, both on the supply side and on the demand side, and they've been considering managed aquifer recharge for some time. And in that second crisis, they had already done some of the work and being led by the city. And in that second crisis is when the central government really came on board. And so they needed that support from the central government to provide that funding to move this investment ahead. And so they determined that they had the technical capacity to go ahead with this approach. It's a deep aquifer. It's not the only aquifer that they have in the area, but it's the one that they decided to use this scheme for. And so that's the approach that sort of anchored their drought resilience plan, at least on the augmentation side of things.
Okay, so I'd like to jump from that then, given that we're looking at local governance, local examples or national examples that are built upon what's available to people and what the solutions might be. To the point that Eileen raised, actually, you talked in your presentation, Eileen, about restoring and rehabilitating schemes that may not be working so well and looking at them rather than just pure service provision, for example, it could be irrigation, but also looking at those as storage options as well, perhaps working more broadly within the landscape and natural systems. And it would be good to try and understand that a little bit more in terms of what the economics of that could be. So how could you get investment into that type of distributed storage, for example? And I wondered if you've got any thoughts on that to try and incentivize that.
Yeah, it's a great question because looking to restore or retrofit or rehab existing infrastructure often has better economics than building new, especially large scale storage in a very general sense. Obviously, there are exceptions to this. But in terms of financing and political economy, it's just not as interesting, right? There are all sorts of risks associated with investing in existing infrastructure rather than building new. And in terms of politicians, right, it's not as, it's much more impressive to deliver a new piece of infrastructure. But I think that's the role that the World Bank and other donors can play in helping governments to create the public incentive to attract the private financing, to help set up and change the infrastructure scheme. I mean, even just within agriculture, and the example you're talking about, James, was listed on the slide in terms of localized storage within existing irrigation schemes. And frankly, that's what's needed for just agriculture to be able to modernize existing schemes already. But then if you look at it from a broader sense across sectors, it can have benefits beyond agriculture if those sectors are figured in. But I think just in the agricultural case, but more broadly as well, there's a need for public sector financing to be able to de-risk the investments, to bring in, to set the stage for the private sector financing to come in. And so I think that's a role of the World Bank and others in helping to de-risk those investments. But I also wanted to hit on too, there was a question in the chat about the Bintuk example using artificial recharge injection wells and whether natural systems could be used as well. And the answer is a resounding yes, as people are considering what types of recharge that can be used. One question that has come up a number of times is whether artificial injection wells are the appropriate mechanism for recharge. And the answer is not always. I think we have a tendency to always want the Cadillac model, to always want the most modern, but in a lot of cases, the most cost-effective and the most appropriate given capacity constraints can be the more natural systems. And so I think that's a major feature of this approach, is looking at the green and gray solutions together, whether it's retrofitting and rehabbing versus new, whether it's more natural solutions versus built. Is looking at all of these options holistically, and that's what we're trying to do in this piece of analytical work that we're advancing with the help of many of our partners.
Great, thanks, Eileen. So one question that sort of really sparked my interest actually on the chat is from, I think it's from Ramesh, and he's directed it at you, Winston, but I think actually it's open play, this one. And the issue is, does this actually, looking at storage as a service, but does that actually improve the efficacy of service provision? For example, if you're a utility downstream, your storage might be more distributed. Therefore, how is that going to help you deliver the services that you have to deliver onwards to your particular consumers? The same potentially for agriculture or even energy. And I wonder if anyone's got any sort of reflections and thoughts on that, because obviously if you're looking at storage as a broader service across, for example, a basin, you're also dealing with an integrated network of stakeholders as well. So you're looking at, effectively a lot of demand and flow on the system at any one time. And I wondered, therefore, that takes an injection into governance and operational scheduling almost. And I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on that, just to sort of try and tackle that question from Ramesh.
Okay, I guess no one's jumping in, so I guess I'll jump in. The answer is yes, of course, right? That's why we're doing this. No, I mean, joking aside, I mean, I think, when we all started thinking about this, we, as was mentioned earlier, we were looking at these big global numbers, global pictures, and I think this is now the beginning of this journey to start getting into more details, really looking at specific river basins, looking at specific countries. I think the belief is, by expanding what we consider as storage, that we are able to put more options in front of communities, stakeholders, people living in a river basin, so forth and so forth. I think the question of whether or not we'll be able to provide more reliable services, more efficient services, more adaptable services, especially in the context of climate change, I mean, I think it remains to be seen. But I think if for those of us who've been working on water resource management and IWRM for a long time, right? I think this belief that integration is needed. It gets us to better economics, gets us to more efficiency, gets us to more equity, and it's messy at the same time. So I don't harbor any illusion that what we're asking or what we're proposing in terms of integrated storage is going to be easy. Not at all. But we also, I think, as William pointed out, we got to do something different than what we've been doing. And those metrics are very clear. So let me leave it at that. Maybe William or others have other thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead, Eileen, please.
I was going to say too, this also comes back to, the answer to this question comes back to the answer on climate as well, and building the system rather than building a piece of single infrastructure. And a lot of the climate work that's been done in looking at water investments going forward, and I'm thinking of work that Casey Brown and others have done with the World Bank and more broadly on decision making under uncertainty, to look at making sure that the investment decisions you make are robust, right? To make sure that given all of these issues that could happen in the future, and all of the uncertainty around hydrology, but as well as institutional uncertainties as well, that the decisions, the investment decisions and the management decisions you're making are robust. One of the challenges and sort of warnings that we're coming up with in our paper as well is that when you are building these systems in as well, that it's also very important not to build in a false sense of security. I mean, I think we're seeing this in energy systems right now, that as energy systems go down, we realize how reliant we are on these systems. And it's even more important as we're building up water systems to make sure that there's not a false sense of security as we're reaching the integration, and that we become more reliant on the water that we have, and that as we're building these systems up, we're even more reliant on them, and that we have to have redundancies built in because failure does happen.
Right. No, you mentioned something there that I think is a really interesting point. I'll come back to that in a minute. But William, over to you. I think you want to add to this as well.
Yeah, just to make a very simple point, which is that, I mean, hydrologically and physically, different forms of storage are already linked. Okay? I think what we're starting, and their interaction can be complementary or competitive. And I think part of what we see in the world today is dysfunctions caused by a disconnect between the institutional forms we have to think about and manage storage and the physical realities. And I think partly what we're advocating for here is to try and bring things onto the same table, into the same conversation. It doesn't necessarily solve them, but what it does is, I think it does make it a little more likely that we can start to address them directly. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. No, a great point, actually. And that just builds on the point I picked up from Eileen. So being more aware of our water storage and building redundancy into the system and improving the transparency of storage, perhaps that's something that countries and water planners have never been particularly aware of the importance of that, improving the transparency of an awareness of a national water security and a national water storage agenda to know exactly what we're dealing with. And I think mentioned by Eileen earlier on that actually, Day Zero in South Africa and Cape Town really perhaps brings that home, that understanding your water availability and your security around water is increasingly important. I don't know if that's part of the storage agenda as well, really, in terms of just that transparency and governance side of things. Hopefully also identifies where you can make the system more resilient or where investment can be directed. Any thoughts on that? No one wants to tell. No? Okay. So look, we've got actually some amazing questions coming in from people. And actually, I think a lot of the people asking the questions are also the people who can help answer them. And I think that's one of the points of really this session and this collaboration amongst these four institutions, is to really try and build this common concern and common awareness around water storage, but also to try and identify what the solutions to that might be as a coalition. And we're really looking for more willing members to join this conversation. We're really keen on understanding and identifying more examples that can, that will help build and certainly use the conceptual framework being developed by the bank and others to reflect upon, to understand, is this viable? Can this go forward? We're really keen on learning lessons from others who've got lessons at different scales, different countries, different range of examples, in particular those who've got examples which are where they actually are the problem holder, where they own the challenge of trying to solve storage and how to do that. One of the things that I think comes back to the points you raised right at the beginning, William, is that this is a vital issue, and perhaps that the water community isn't fully aware of the importance of just how vital this is. I think the slide shown by Rachel at the beginning showing a 0.1% of actual built storage globally for water, and that's declining, is actually really quite quite scary in the sense of the amount of water that we're going to need to store going forward and the amount of water that we're going to need to capture due to snowmelt and glacial melt due to climate change. And I think what we've seen today is that whilst current approaches are not good enough, there are definite examples and case studies and things that are coming to the fore now where people are looking at trying to innovate in this space. And maybe we do need to learn these lessons from these really intense areas like the situation in Windhoek in 2016 and Zero in Cape Town, that really concentrate the mind to look for those solutions and identifying those sort of more innovative, local and technical options as well. So with that, I will stop there. We are out of time. I want to thank everybody for their presentations. William, Rachel, Winston, Eileen and Kimberly, for your great participation, great knowledge and insights, and for the audience who've given us some great questions. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of what is left of Virtual World Water Week. Thank you.